morning I walked out of the courthouse with my divorce papers. I sat in my car for 11 minutes and didn't move. I remember the exact number because I watched the dashboard clock tick from 10:47 to 10:58. And during that time, I didn't cry, didn't call anyone, didn't do anything except hold that manila envelope against my chest like it was something fragile. Like it might shatter if I breathed too hard. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like anything yet. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my father. How did it go? I typed back, "It's done. Call you in 5." I set the envelope on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking garage into the gray October sky of Denver. And somewhere between the third stoplight and the on-ramp to I-25, something shifted inside me. Not relief exactly. More like the moment after a fever finally breaks. That strange hollow clarity when your body remembers what it felt like to be well. I called my father. "Dad," I said, "I need you to fire them. All of them. Today." There was a pause on the line. My father, Vincent Holloway, did not pause often. He was the kind of man who made decisions the way other people breathed, quickly, without ceremony, without needing to think twice. So when he paused, I paid attention. "All of them," he repeated. Every single person Colton brought into Holloway Freight. Sandra, his brother, Derek, his cousin who you made assistant logistics coordinator, even though he'd never worked a day in supply chain. "All of them, Dad. I need them gone." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Give me until end of business," he said. That was my father. No lecture. No, "Are you sure about this?" Or "Let's think this through." He had spent the last 14 months watching his only daughter get dismantled piece by piece, and by the time I asked him for the one thing that was actually in his power to give me, he didn't hesitate. He just needed a few hours to do it right. I should tell you about Colton first, because this story doesn't make sense without him, and I've spent a long time trying to figure out how to talk about him without making myself sound naive, or bitter, or like I'm rewriting history to make myself the obvious hero I clearly wasn't at the time. I met Colton Briggs when I was 32. He was charming in the specific way that's hard to describe until you've experienced it. Not flashy, not the guy who walks into a room and commands it. More like the guy who finds you in the room and makes you feel like the only person worth talking to. He listened. He remembered things. On our third date, he brought up a book I'd mentioned in passing on our first, and he'd actually read it. I thought that meant something. We dated for 2 years. Got married in September. I was 34, old enough to know better, young enough to still believe that love was a reliable indicator of character. My father liked Colton well enough at the beginning. Dad ran Holloway Freight, a regional logistics and supply chain company he'd built over 30 years, from a 2-truck operation in Commerce City into a $40 million business with contracts across 6 states. He was protective of it the way some men are protective of their children. Maybe more so, honestly. When Colton and I got married, there was a conversation I should have paid more attention to. Colton mentioned casually, over dinner at my parents' house, that he'd love to learn more about the business. He framed it as wanting to understand my world. Dad said he was welcome to visit the operations center anytime. That was the door. And over the next 2 years, Colton walked through it, then propped it open, then started inviting people in. It started with Sandra. Sandra was Colton's sister. 38, sharp, ambitious in the way that looks like competence until you realize it has no actual floor. Colton suggested her for a regional coordinator role that had opened up. Just a mid-level position, he said, nothing major. She had some logistics background, at least on paper. My father was skeptical. I told him to give her a chance. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but the one I think about most. Sandra hired Derek, Colton's younger brother, as her assistant within 3 months of starting. Derek had worked at a car rental company and a cell phone store. He had no logistics experience whatsoever. Sandra told my father he was a quick learner, and by that point, she'd made herself useful enough that my father didn't push back hard. Then came Marcus. No, wait. I need to stop. The names blur together when I list them like this. The point is that by month 18 of our marriage, there were 6 people connected to Colton's family working inside Holloway Freight. 6 people in departments that touched contracts, vendor relationships, billing, and fleet coordination. I didn't see it for what it was. I want to be honest about that. I thought it was Colton being proud of his family, wanting to help them build careers, wanting to feel connected to the part of my life that mattered most. I told myself it was sweet, even. A man who wanted to be part of his wife's world. What it actually was. A very patient, Very deliberate strategy to embed people into every department that handled money. I found out the way you find out things you weren't supposed to find. Not dramatically. Not with a smoking gun or a confrontation. I found out because our accountant, a woman named Beverly, who'd worked for my father for 11 years, and had the energy of someone who took everything personally, called me on a Wednesday afternoon in February and said, "Eleanor, I need you to look at something. Can you come in?" I still don't know why she called me instead of my father. Maybe she sensed that whatever she'd found was going to be painful for him to hear. Maybe she thought I'd be steadier. Maybe it was just habit, because I'd been coming into the office more and more that year, taking on more responsibility as Dad started talking about slowing down. I went in that afternoon. Beverly showed me 3 months of vendor invoices from a company called Centerpoint Logistics Solutions, a small freight brokerage out of Aurora that Holloway had recently started routing some contracts through. The invoices looked normal at first glance, but Beverly had run the numbers, and when she compared Centerpoint's rates against what Holloway was actually paying in operating costs, the markup was significant. Not outrageous enough to immediately scream fraud. Significant enough that it needed an explanation. "Who approved these contracts?" I asked. Beverly pulled up internal approval chain on her screen. Derek's name was on 2 of them. Sandra's name was on the 3rd. A 4th had been approved by a man named— I had to look twice— a man named Colton Briggs, in his capacity as operations consultant, a title I had not known he had. "When did my husband become an operations consultant?" I said. Beverly looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. "About 4 months ago," she said. "Your father approved it. I think he thought it was informal. A way for Colton to feel involved." I took a copy of everything Beverly had, and I went home and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Colton came home around 7. He kissed me on the cheek, opened the refrigerator, asked what I wanted for dinner. I said I wasn't hungry. And I watched him move around our kitchen and I thought, how long? That was the question I couldn't let go of. Not what. Because what was already becoming clear, but how long had he known exactly what he was doing? I didn't say anything to him that night. I didn't say anything to my father. I went back to Beverly the next morning and asked her to pull everything she could on Centerpoint Logistics Solutions without alerting anyone. What she found over the next 3 weeks was worse than I'd expected. Centerpoint was a shell company, registered in Colorado 18 months ago. Sole owner, a woman named Patricia Briggs. Colton's mother. The invoices Beverly had flagged were just the ones she'd noticed. When we went back further, when we went through every vendor payment that had touched departments where Colton's family had approval authority, the total came to just under $2.8 million over 14 months. $2.8 million routed through a fake company owned by my mother-in-law, approved in pieces small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits, signed off by people Colton had spent 2 years carefully placing inside my father's company. I went to my father with Beverly and a forensic accountant Beverly had recommended. Dad sat at his desk and listened to the whole thing without saying a word. When Beverly finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "I should have listened to myself in the beginning." He meant when Colton had first brought Sandra in. Dad had been skeptical. I'd been the one to say give her a chance. "This isn't your fault," I told him. "It's not yours either," he said. And the way he said it, carefully, like he was making sure I heard it, made my throat tight. We went to an attorney that afternoon. Then to the FBI field office in Denver, because when you're talking about wire fraud across state lines, it stops being a civil matter. The agents we met with were thorough and undramatic about it, which was somehow worse than if they'd been shocked. They acted like this was just another Wednesday, which I suppose for them it was. They advised us not to tip anyone off, to continue operating normally while they gathered additional documentation, to not confront Colton, Sandra, Derek, or anyone else connected to the scheme. That was the hardest part. Coming home every night and sitting across the dinner table from Colton, listening to him talk about his day, pretending I didn't know. It lasted 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I also hired a private investigator, not because I needed more ammunition. The financial case was already being built without my help, but because I had a feeling there was something else I hadn't found yet. I don't know what made me look. Maybe I just knew. The way you sometimes know things about a person before you have proof. The way your body registers what your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The investigator sent me photos on a Tuesday. I was in a meeting when they came through. I excused myself, went to the bathroom, and stood in a stall and looked at them for a long time. Colton and a woman named Renata. She managed one of our smaller vendor accounts. They'd been seeing each other for at least 8 months. I thought I'd feel something catastrophic when I found out. I thought it would hollow me out, the way betrayal is supposed to. Instead, I felt something cold and very clear settle in my chest, like ice forming. Because here was the thing. Now I understood the whole picture. It wasn't just greed. Colton and Renata, and probably Colton's family, had all been working together, running out the clock on a marriage they'd never intended to be permanent. They just needed long enough to extract what they could. I filed for divorce the following week. Colton was served at the office, which I'll admit I did intentionally. Not out of cruelty, I just wanted him to know that I knew exactly what he was, and I wasn't going to give him the courtesy of privacy. He called me from the parking garage immediately after. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something underneath it. Not guilt, not remorse. Calculation. He was already deciding what to do next. "Eleanor, we should talk about this before it gets complicated," he said. "It's already complicated, Colton," I said. "It became complicated when your mother set up a shell company and your sister started running invoices through it." Silence. Long enough that I counted to 7. "I don't know what you think you know," he finally said. "I know exactly what I know," I said. "I'll be speaking to my attorney. You should speak to yours." I hung up. I sat in my car for a moment. Then I went back inside and returned to my meeting. That was 3 months before I walked out of the courthouse with those divorce papers. In the meantime, the FBI investigation continued. We cooperated fully. My father had engaged outside legal counsel to pursue civil recovery in addition to the criminal referral. His HR team had been quietly documenting every policy violation they could find tied to Sandra and Derek's conduct. Because when you're firing someone, for cause, who might also be named in a federal investigation, you want your paperwork airtight. Colton's attorney filed a counterclaim in the divorce proceedings, arguing that Colton's contributions to Holloway Freight over the course of the marriage, his informal consulting role, his introductions to vendors, entitled him to some consideration in the asset division. This argument was so spectacular in its audacity that my divorce attorney actually laughed out loud when she called to tell me about it. "He helped you find vendors," she said. "Vendors who were funneling money to his mother. He's asking to be compensated for that." "What did you say?" I asked. "I said we'd see him in court," she said. "Colorado is a marital property state, but there are exceptions when one spouse's conduct, including financial misconduct, has materially harmed marital assets." Colton's attorney pushed hard. Mine pushed harder. By the time we finalized the settlement, Colton received a number that represented his fair share of what was legitimately marital, and nothing else. The shell company scheme was excluded from consideration as marital contribution, because a judge agreed that what Colton had contributed was, in fact, a fraud. He signed the papers on a Thursday. I picked them up from my attorney's office on Friday morning, and then I sat in that courthouse parking garage and watched the clock tick from 10:47 to 10:58, and then I called my father. By end of business that same day, Sandra and Derek and 4 other employees connected to the Briggs family had been terminated. HR had prepared individual termination packages for each of them. Proper severance where legally required. Documentation of cause where that applied. It was done cleanly, professionally, the way my father always did things, because even in this he wouldn't compromise on how Holloway Freight operated. That evening, I went to my father's house for dinner. He lived in a house in Cherry Hills Village that he'd bought the year before I was born. A wide colonial with a front yard that was always slightly overgrown because Dad thought manicured lawns were pretentious. I let myself in with my key. I could smell dinner already. He'd made pasta, which was the only thing he cooked reliably. We were halfway through dinner when we heard it. A car pulling up outside. Then voices. More than one. Several. Getting louder. My father looked at me across the table. I looked back. We both knew who it was. Patricia Briggs was standing in the driveway when my father opened the front door. Colton's mother. A woman I had spent 4 years trying to build a genuine relationship with. A woman I had made excuses for when she made cutting remarks. A woman I had convinced myself was difficult, but not malicious. She was not alone. Sandra was there. Derek was there. 2 other relatives I recognized from family events, but couldn't name. They had not knocked. They had pulled up to my father's house in 2 cars and gotten out, and Patricia had even reached the front steps. "You destroyed my family," she said. You destroyed my family, she said. She was pointing at my father first, then at me. You took everything. You had them fired. They have children. Do you understand that? Sandra has 2 children. You did this to their children. My father said nothing. He stood in the doorway and he let her finish. Colton worked for this company, she said. He gave years of his life to this company, and you threw him away like he was nothing. Patricia, my father said. His voice was very calm. Holloway Freight was defrauded of approximately $2.8 million through a company registered in your name. That landed like something physical. Sandra's face went still. Derek looked at the ground. Patricia didn't stop. That money was compensation, she said, and her voice had changed. More careful now, but still loud. We weren't paid what we were worth. We weren't compensated fairly. You weren't employees, my father said. Centerpoint Logistics Solutions was not an employee. It was a company you owned that submitted fraudulent invoices for services that were not rendered at the agreed rates. We provided services. The FBI has reviewed the invoices, Patricia, he said. Quietly, just like that. The relevant agencies are aware of the situation. She stopped. The word FBI went through that driveway like a weather change. Sandra reached out and touched her mother's arm. One of the relatives I didn't know took a small step back. Patricia looked at me. And I want to be careful here, because I've thought about this moment many times since. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I think I was supposed to feel. What I felt was tired. I felt tired and sad in a way that had nothing to do with Colton and everything to do with the fact that this woman, who I had tried to know, who I had tried to make room for in my life, had looked at my family's company and seen only what could be taken from it. I want the terminations reversed, Patricia said, but the heat had gone out of her voice. That's not going to happen, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since they arrived. Sandra and Derek are no longer Holloway employees. That decision has been made, the paperwork is complete, and it isn't going to change. You can't just— We can, I said. We did. Colorado is an at-will employment state. The cause documentation is thorough. If anyone wants to contest the terminations, they're welcome to take it up with our legal team. Another silence. You should go home, my father said. Not unkindly. Just finally. They left. Not immediately. There was some low talking among themselves. Patricia saying something to Sandra I couldn't hear. But they got back in their cars and they left. My father closed the front door. We went back to the kitchen. The pasta had gone cold. He reheated it, and we sat back down and we didn't talk about what had just happened for a long time. We just ate. Eventually, my father said, You handled that well. You handled it, I said. You, he said. He pointed his fork at me with some emphasis. You've been handling it for months. All of it. You're the one who found it. I didn't say anything because I was fairly sure I would cry if I tried, and I had done enough crying in the past few months for several lifetimes. In the weeks after that, things moved the way legal processes move, slowly, then suddenly. Colton's attorney reached out once more about the settlement, suggesting that the criminal investigation created changed circumstances worth discussing. My attorney told them nothing had changed. The settlement stood. Sandra and Derek hired attorneys of their own. There were letters, then counter letters, then a period of silence that my attorney said was normal and didn't mean anything. Patricia, from what I understood through channels I wasn't directly part of, was cooperating with investigators, which her attorney had no doubt advised was her best available option. Renata resigned from her position at the vendor company. I had nothing to do with that. She must have known that what she and Colton had done, given that her role as a vendor contact had been part of how he laundered his access, was going to come out eventually. Colton, from what I knew, was staying with a friend. His attorney was negotiating on his behalf. He did not contact me directly after that parking garage call, and I did not contact him. I moved back into the house. My house, the one I'd owned before we married, that I'd rented out during the marriage because Colton had wanted us to get something that was ours. I unpacked the things I'd put in storage. I went through the closets and set aside everything that wasn't mine. I donated 3 bags of things that were mine, but that I didn't want anymore, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. I started running again, which I'd stopped during the marriage because Colton found early mornings inconvenient. I ran before dawn, in the cold, down empty streets in my neighborhood, and it was one of the only times during that period when my head felt genuinely quiet. I went back to work. This was the part that surprised me most, how much I'd missed it. Holloway Freight wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a tech startup or a law firm or anything that sounded impressive when you told people what you did at parties. It was trucks and contracts and logistics software and calls at 6 in the morning because a shipment had been delayed in Pueblo. But it was built with my father's hands over 30 years. And it existed because he had been stubborn enough and careful enough and persistent enough to build it. And it was going to survive this because the core of it, the actual work, the actual relationships with carriers and clients who'd been with us for a decade, none of that had been compromised. I had a meeting with our top 3 clients in the first week I was back. I told them there had been some personnel changes, that we were tightening our vendor oversight protocols, and that I wanted to personally reaffirm our commitment to their contracts. None of them left. One of them, a woman who ran a regional grocery distribution network, told me she'd noticed some unusual billing patterns in the past year and had almost brought it up, but hadn't wanted to make assumptions. You can always bring it up, I told her. That's what the relationship is for. She seemed pleased by that. We had coffee. She sent a referral our way the following month. My father started talking, more seriously, about stepping back. He was 67 and had been running the company without a real break for most of his adult life. We started having formal conversations about what a transition would look like, what I'd take on, what he'd remain involved in, what made sense for the company's next phase. It was during one of those conversations that he said something I've thought about, often since. When I was deciding whether to trust Colton's family with the business, he said, "I knew I had doubts. I let them go because I didn't want to upset you, and I've spent a lot of time being angry at myself for that." I started to say something, but he held up a hand. "I'm not telling you this, so you apologize. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I made that decision. You didn't make it for me. I chose to override my own judgment, and that's on me. You shouldn't carry that." I looked at my father across his desk, in the office he'd been sitting in since before I was born, and I thought about how strange it was that we'd managed to come through something this damaging and still be sitting across from each other having this conversation. That the thing that was supposed to break us, the thing Colton and his family had spent 2 years setting up, hadn't broken us, had maybe even, in some strange way, clarified something. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. "The criminal case is ongoing. I won't pretend to know how it ends because federal cases take time, and I've learned not to hold my breath for any particular outcome. What I know is that the documentation exists, the cooperation happened, and the decisions we made. To investigate properly, to involve the right authorities, to not just quietly let it go, mean that at minimum, the truth is on record. Colton and I have not spoken since the parking garage. I don't expect we will. Sandra sent me a text once, 6 weeks after she was terminated. It said, 'I hope you're proud of yourself.' I read it, didn't respond, and blocked the number. I wasn't angry, I just didn't have anything to say. What I am now is this. I'm 38 years old. I co-run a logistics company. I wake up early and run in the dark and come home and make my own coffee and sit at my own kitchen table. I'm tired some days in a way that goes deeper than sleep fixes. I'm also, increasingly, okay. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd paid more attention, earlier, to the small wrongnesses I'd explained away. The times Sandra had been too familiar with my father's schedule. The times Colton had shown unusual interest in vendor contracts. The times I'd chosen the version of events that was easier to believe. I wish I hadn't needed Beverly to find what I should have found myself. But I've also stopped punishing myself for being someone who tried to trust the people she loved. That's not the part that was wrong. The part that was wrong was theirs. My mother used to tell me that some people will look at what you've built and only ever see what they can take from it. She said the hard part isn't identifying those people after the fact. The hard part is recognizing them in real time, when they're still using the face they want you to see. I think about that when I drive into the lot at Holloway Freight and see the name on the side of the building. My grandfather's last name, my father's last name, my last name. It's not a monument to anything except a very long commitment to showing up and doing the work, honestly. That's what they didn't understand. Any of them. The company wasn't just money, it was proof of something. And you don't walk away from proof.